Genesis Supreme, is it really you? If you're okay, that's wonderful. The Imperial Prison Revolt had alarmed many people, including the spies and Yaluoshan had left in the capital. The news that Genesis Supreme had been killed in the skies above the capital had been a major shock to the Yuzhou group. Even though Genesis Supreme had always treated them with unconcealed contempt, his vast cultivation and the enormous resources under his control made him the greatest backer of the Yuzhou group. In terms of gold, Genesis Supreme had provided hundreds of millions of taels, an enormous sum for any country. It was precisely because of this vast fortune that Yaluoshan was able to recruit so many soldiers. And this wasn't even considering that Genesis Supreme had assisted Yaluoshan in creating his strongest army, the Yeluo. Humph. Did you really think I died? Genesis Supreme grunted in extreme displeasure. The generals shivered and lowered their heads. Ha! How could that be? It's fine as long as Venerable One is well. And Yaluoshan didn't take the words to heart and laughed. There was a small problem, and I fell into a trap set up by that brat. But there will be no next time. Once I have changed into a new body, I will return, and then I will tear that brat's body to pieces, Genesis Supreme viciously said. Everyone mentally trembled at these words, and Gao Shang slightly frowned, feeling both fear and something else. From Genesis Supreme's words, he could tell that the reports from the Imperial Palace had not been wrong. He truly had been killed by Wang Chong, but somehow he had not died. For him, it seemed to merely be a matter of changing his body. The death of a human was a light going out. This was a principle that all of them understood. He had never heard about a situation like Genesis Supreme's. It was beyond the realm of human understanding. From a certain perspective, he really did seem like an immortal god. This god was listening to your conversation. There is no need for you to worry about the Great Tang's million-man army or that fortress in the northeast. This god has already made arrangements. In addition, I have already ordered my subordinates to send over the third batch of Yeluo. This time, it is not 8,000, but 20,000. When the time comes, send someone to receive them, Genesis Supreme sternly said. What? The generals glanced at each other in excitement. 20,000 Yeluo? Together with the first two batches, didn't that mean that Yuzhou now had 36,000 Yeluo warriors? The Yeluo were special soldiers created by the Yuzhou group and Genesis Supreme. Each one was extremely powerful, capable of contending against 1,000. More importantly, Yeluo warriors were extremely sturdy, seemingly able to survive even the most dire of injuries. If they had 36,000 Yeluo warriors, what was there to fear about the Great Tang's army of 1 million? Wonderful! If that's true, we won't even need to wait for the agreed 4 months and can just attack immediately, Xianxia excitedly said. An additional 20,000 Yeluo was like 400,000 ordinary soldiers. The boost this gave to Yuzhou was inestimable. Very good. This was exactly what this god wanted to say. I do not give this batch of Yeluo for free. This god has only one condition. You must attack early. This god cannot wait for even one additional moment. I want that brat crushed into powder. Genesis Supreme's voice was suffused with immense hatred. Wang Chong hadn't even reached the Grotto Heaven realm, but he had almost died to such a puny ant. His soul nearly scattered. Genesis Supreme could not endure this sort of disgrace. He had gotten in touch with Yaluoshan this time precisely so that he could borrow Yaluoshan's strength to sow chaos in the realm and have Wang Chong killed early. So that's what it was about. If you want to kill that brat, we have no objection. Once those 20,000 Yeluo arrive, we'll immediately set out, crush their armies, and take the central plains. And Yaluoshan heartily laughed, agreeing without a second thought. What sort of burden was this? This was being gifted a pillow when feeling drowsy. They had just been talking about the fortress and the recruitment of soldiers, and now Genesis Supreme had delivered 20,000 of the Supreme Yeluo to them. This was the most pleasant of surprises. If this was the power of the child of the world, then one could say that Wang Chong had helped him out. Very good. I will send those soldiers over soon. I hope that you will not disappoint this god. Genesis Supreme nodded, and with a thump, The phantom exploded into black smoke. I will wait for the good news. Genesis Supreme's voice in the black flute dwindled away, after which the flute ceased to ripple with energy and returned to normal. Once Genesis Supreme's presence had faded, the mountaintop fell silent, and Yaluishan and his subordinates glanced at each other, their smiles quickly fading, and Yaluishan twitched his wrist, placing a barrier of energy around the black flute that cut off all sound. This Genesis Supreme can't be trusted. But we need those 20,000 Yeluo. And Yaluishan's face darkened as he turned to Gao Shang. Gao Shang, time is short. Write 2 letters asking Yusang and the Western Turks if they've made up their mind yet. Yes. Gao Shang hastily lowered his head, and Yaluishan turned to Cui Qianyu. Cui Qianyu Tianqianjin, if we're beginning our attack early, we need to discuss the details of deployment with our allies. Yes, the generals called out and lowered their heads, and Yaluishan nodded and said no more, immediately heading off for the Anong Protectorate headquarters. In the main hall of the headquarters was a model that he had ordered to be made, detailing the geography of the Central Plains and the distribution of soldiers. A very long discussion was ahead of them. The group quickly dispersed, and a few moments later, messenger birds took flight to Yusang and the Western Turkic Khaganate. As the snowstorm continued to wreak havoc, the temperature continued to drop, and the cold wave continued its ceaseless advance to the south. At this time, high atop the Tibetan plateau, tiny snowflakes drifted down from the sky and blanketed the region. In the royal palace of Yusang, the Tibetan commanders had gathered, Dalen Trinling seated above them all. In the center of the hall, upon that throne that had been passed down for hundreds of years, sat the Tsenpo, his expression grave. Yusang's imperial ministers usually handled daily affairs, even more so during Dalen Trinling's tenure, and the Tsenpo rarely took part in court sessions. This was because Dalen Trinling was more than capable of handling the empire's daily affairs, and if Dalen Trinling couldn't handle it, the Tsenpo probably couldn't handle it either. But this time was different. The terrifying calamity the Holy Temple had prophesied several thousand years ago was imminent. For many years, the Yusang Empire had relied on the unique terrain of the plateau to avoid disaster after disaster, but not even the lofty altitude could protect Yusang from this cold wave. Many cows and sheep had frozen to death, and the cold wave showed no signs of stopping. If this went on, the empire's destruction was not far off. The royal palace was fraught with tension. Your Majesty, Imperial Minister, this cold wave cannot be underestimated. We have already sent men to investigate, and we have found that Goguryeo, Yuzhou, the eastern and western Turkic Khaganates, the western regions, and our own Yusang are all feeling the effects of this snowstorm. Extreme cold and ice storms have pervaded the world from east to west. Such cold climate is unheard of, and even the central plains are showing signs of freezing, a thick-bearded and hairy Tibetan general reported. If this trend continues, if nothing changes, the entire plateau will be covered in ice and snow in another 1 or 2 months, and countless people will have frozen to death. Another Tibetan general stood up and said, "It might not even be just 1 month. Already, tens of thousands of people in the empire have frozen to death, and 1 million head of livestock have died. We'll be running into food shortages soon. The situation doesn't look good." Yusang's altitude made its situation somewhat better for now, but not by much. Can we really not endure this cold wave? The Tsenpo suddenly blurted out, his brow furrowed in unease. He had also received the reports on the snowstorm, and some places were probably in far worse condition than his generals reported. No one had ever encountered a situation like this, and nobody knew how to deal with it. The hall was silent, and everyone began to turn to Dalen Trinling. It's very difficult. It's not showing any signs of stopping so far. Dalen Trinling shook his head and spoke calmly. Namri Songtian, have you done what I asked? Imperial Minister Tsenpo, everything has been taken care of. All of the shepherds are beginning to make their way south, and it should buy us a little more time. But this does not address the root of the problem, Namri Songtian sternly said. The snowstorm was moving from north to south. While the northern parts had been turned into a land of ice and snow, with countless livestock frozen to death or pelted to death by hail, The lands on the southern face of the Tibetan plateau, those of the Ngari royal lineage, had not been as harshly affected, giving the Yusang Empire a chance to catch its breath. For the lands of the Ngari royal lineage, rendered deserted by Wang Chong's sheep plague during the Great Tang's War of the Southwest, to play such an important role during this calamity was truly surprising. But all of them knew that if the snowstorm continued to advance, they would still not be able to escape. And what of the Great Tang? That Senpo suddenly asked. Is the Great Tang really not affected at all? We recall that they still have several steel fortresses at the Triangular Gap, yes? And what of the western regions? What are all those little kingdoms doing right now? The steel fortresses Wang Chong had erected on the northeast corner of the Tibetan plateau had been a constant problem for Yusang. They should have been in the first area to suffer from this disaster. Although Yusang had suffered heavy losses, if the Tang army at the Triangular Gap was completely wiped out, the losses would be somewhat more acceptable. A Tibetan general in charge of gathering intelligence reported, "Your Majesty, long before the ice storm, the Great Tang withdrew all its soldiers from the Triangular Gap. The Triangular Gap is currently an abandoned city, and they have completely given up on it. We've sent men to investigate and found not a single Tang there. As for the kingdoms of the western regions, they're divided into two groups. One crossed the Tsong Mountains into Arabia, while the other retreated into the interior of the Great Tang." What? The Tsenpo instantly scowled. Under Wang Chong's command, the Great Tang had gone through great lengths to invade and occupy the Triangular Gap, even erecting a steel fortress there. Ever since then, the steel fortress in the Triangular Gap had been the greatest of threats to Yusang. But to everyone's surprise, the Great Tang had so easily abandoned the Triangular Gap it had worked so hard to take. This bastard! The Tsenpo clenched his fists, his expression nasty. The generals in the hall lowered their heads. Compared to Yusang, the Great Tang was clearly much more prepared. Dalen Trinling seemed to realize something and turned to another general. "Mangyil, several days ago, I had you investigate how the Great Tang was dealing with this disaster. Do you have any news?" With a strange expression on his face, the Tibetan general bowed and said, "Imperial Minister Tsenpo, we have found that as the Great Tang is positioned more to the south than us, and because they have the Turks in the north to buffer them, they have not suffered any severe damage from this disaster as of yet. But we have also discovered something strange. Long before the Great Cold Wave began to move south, the Great Tang's king of foreign lands began to purchase large quantities of kerosene from Arabia. At the time, we believed that this was for military purposes, but now the matter no longer appears as simple. Besides kerosene, the Great Tang has also accumulated large quantities of coal, cotton, and wool. It has also bought large quantities of grain which it has recently distributed to all its provinces. It appears that they were prepared for the cold front several months before it arrived." Bang! The hall exploded into an uproar. How could this be? 2 months ago, there was no sign of a cold wave anywhere in the continent. How could they have been ready so early? Could it be a coincidence? Impossible. Kerosene, cotton, coal, wool. These items are all used to resist cold. If they didn't know about it beforehand, how could they have started preparing 2 months ahead of time? And how could they have accumulated so much? If that's true, then the Great Tang's king of foreign lands is far too frightening. All of the people in the hall had incredulous looks on their faces, like they had seen a ghost. Dalen Trinling said nothing, his head lowered and his eyes twitching. As the imperial minister revered by all Tibetans, Dalen Trinling was renowned throughout the world for his intelligence. But not even Dalen Trinling could see through many of the actions of that youth of the Great Tang. All the other countries had been left in disarray by the Great Cold Wave. But long before anyone else, Wang Chong had begun to buy food, cotton, and other such items. It had all seemed very normal at the time, and who could have imagined that these things would be connected to the Great Cold Wave? Truly unfathomable. As these thoughts flashed through Dalen Trinling's mind, his heart was filled with fear. Only this young war saint could exert such immense pressure on him. "There's not much time left," Dalen Trinling muttered so softly that only he could hear. Yusang couldn't last for long. A solution needed to be found before that cold wave fully descended. Whoosh! The oppressive air was broken by the flapping of wings. A few moments later, a Tibetan general received the messenger bird and said, "Senpo, Imperial Minister, a letter from Yuzhou. Again about the alliance?" Dalen Trinling said. The general glanced at the contents of the letter before replying, "Yes." Dalen Trinling nodded, completely unsurprised. He had already received several letters from Inauthentic asking him to make a decision on the alliance, but Dalen Trinling had still not made his stance clear. He knew more than anyone else what Inauthentic wanted. This new Anong Protector General had an ambition far greater than his status, and a greed and daring that far exceeded those of the other countries. For these various countries, this sort of internal discord in the Great Tang was a gift delivered right to their doorsteps. Dalen Trinling also had no objections to this Hu Protector General. But Dalen Trinling had always been cautious about this request of Inauthentic's. The past was an example for the future. Even the mighty Arabian Empire with its million invincible cavalry had been vanquished by the Great Tang, let alone a country like Yusang. The Great Tang now was not the Great Tang of the past. Even though Dalen Trinling wanted revenge, he needed to be extremely cautious. But, Imperial Minister, this time is somewhat different. Besides Inauthentic in Yuzhou, the leaders of Goguryeo, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, the Khitans, and the Shi have also sent letters. The general added. What? Dalen Trinling raised his head in surprise, his body trembling. The general quickly offered up the letters. Whoosh! Dalen Trinling waved his hand, upon which the letters shot through the air and into his grip. Dalen Trinling quickly read through the letters, and his face began to change. The general was right. The letter this time was different, as Inauthentic had convinced the queen of the Shi, the king of the Khitans, Yun Gaisaman of Goguryeo, and Osmish Khagan of the Eastern Turks to send letters as well. All of these letters were trying to convince Dalen Trinling and Yusang to make their stance known as soon as possible, to join their alliance against the Great Tang. Inauthentic, you truly did not let me down. If you could so quickly persuade all these other countries, I really underestimated you before, Dalen Trinling muttered. Even he was forced to look at Inauthentic with new eyes now. Getting all the other countries on the same page was no easy task. He had not expected Inauthentic to progress so quickly. Imperial Minister, what does it say? That Senpo asked. Dalen Trinling did not directly answer, simply passing the letters to him. A few moments later, that Senpo finished reading, and with a solemn expression, he had the other generals in the hall read it. Only by gathering ideas could one maximize benefit. This was no simple war. The existence of Yusang was on the line. When blizzards descended and ice sealed the world, even the vast Yusang Empire would face annihilation. Generals, what is your view? That Senpo said a few moments later. The generals fell silent, all of them turning in concert to Dalen Trinling. At any time, there was only one person in the Yusang Empire who could truly decide. The Imperial Minister. Imperial Minister, Inauthentic has settled everything. A general broke the silence and voiced everyone's thoughts. The forces of Goguryeo, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, the Shi, and the Khitans, combined with those of Yuzhou, form an incredibly powerful faction. If we do not join now, then once Inauthentic succeeds, we will not be able to partake in any spoils. Just close our eyes and wait for death atop the plateau. Moreover, the situation is already extremely unfavorable to us. Across the continent, the Great Tang has the best terrain. If we wish to avoid the blizzard, we must leave the plateau and enter the central plains. In addition, the Great Tang is clearly prepared, having stockpiled vast quantities of food, kerosene, coal, cotton, and wool. The resources of all the other countries added together probably do not even reach half of their stockpiles. If we wish to endure this bitter cold, we must attack the Great Tang. Daluan Ruozan, Dusong Mangpoj, Huashu Huaitsong. Almost all of the elites of our Yusang have lost their lives to the Tang. No matter the time, the Great Tang will always be our Yusang's greatest foe. Man cannot fight with the heavens. Only by joining with the other countries and attacking the Great Tang can we avenge those lost soldiers, and only then can we survive. Even Namri Songtian had turned to Dalen Trinling. It was clear that he had the same idea as all the other generals. Yu Sang was a mortal foe of the Great Tang, and with the internal discord within the Great Tang and Yaluishan commanding an army that could threaten the Great Tang, the other countries had an ideal opportunity. Let me think some more. Dalen Trinling closed his eyes and thought. He understood what the generals were thinking, but this was a matter of utmost importance, and he could not make a decision recklessly. The generals found it hard to conceal their disappointment, but none of them dared to question the imperial minister's decision. Boom! As everyone hesitated, the sound of a horn rang out through the royal palace. As the horn blared, everyone's minds shivered, and the image of a vast snowy mountain soaring into the heavens appeared in everyone's minds. The horn of the Great Snow Mountain. Everyone turned in shock toward the source of the sound. Everyone knew that at the highest point of the Great Snow Mountain Holy Temple, the holy land of Yusang, was a massive white horn. This was a sacred object of the temple and a symbol of the highest authority in the empire. Only the high monk was permitted to use it. Over the course of decades, this horn had rarely been used. Everyone knew that when the horn blew, something important had happened. More importantly, each blare of the horn was accompanied by a prophecy. Dalen Trinling, come to the holy temple. An ancient voice, tinged with a soul-soothing power, resounded through the hall. High monk! Everyone was alarmed by this voice, even the Tsenpo rising from his throne. The high monk did not appear for just anything. Had the holy temple produced a new prophecy? The Tsenpo felt a vague unease. But regardless of what they thought, the high monk's energy vanished after he had said what he had come to say. You're all dismissed. I will pay a visit to the holy temple. As for Yuzhou, that can wait until after I come back. Dalen Trinling had also considered the possibility of a prophecy, and with a grave look on his face, he quickly left the hall. Dalen Trinling set off for the holy temple, and no one knew what conversation transpired there. But half a day later, whoosh! A messenger bird took flight from the royal palace of Yusang, carrying with it Dalen Trinling's handwritten letter to Yuzhou. After a long period of hesitation, Yusang had finally agreed to join the alliance. At this time, an enormous alliance had taken form to the north of the Great Tang. The only country that had yet to express its stance was the Western Turkic Khaganate. Meanwhile, in the capital of the Great Tang, the weather was dark and gloomy, cold winds howling. In this short period of time, the temperature of the Central Plains had dropped 10-some degrees, and it felt like winter had come early. Many of the large families had already started coal fires. It was possible to see hawkers selling firewood on every street, twice the normal amount. The bustling streets of the capital were now much more desolate. Rather than pedestrians, patrolling horsemen from the city guard were now a common sight. Meanwhile, to the southwest of the imperial palace, the king of foreign lands' residence. In the main hall, a coal brazier forged in the shape of a beast head was placed in the center, the flames within burning bright red and radiating warmth. Wang Chong and Su Qichin were seated across from each other, dressed respectively in black clothes and a white dress. On the sandalwood table between them was a teapot, 2 cups, and several plates of pastries. The atmosphere was extremely quiet and serene. All the coal has been delivered to the provinces according to plan. As for the kerosene, 20% has been allotted for distribution to the various circuits, while the rest has been delivered to the front lines of the northeast and northwest. Besides that, all the cloth and blankets made from the cotton and wool have been distributed. As for the local situation, the governments of the provinces have posted announcements to calm the people, and all the villagers in remote areas have already been moved to safe zones near the county cities. The local governments have also expanded the ranks of the bailiffs to maintain order and safety. But even so, the situation is not good at all. The temperature is dropping far too quickly, and the moat outside the city is already starting to freeze. Moreover, this drop in temperature is showing no signs of stopping. We've already sent men to the north, and from what they have seen, the Great Cold Wave is advancing on the Turkic Khaganates and Goguryeo. In a month at most, these countries will be completely engulfed by the blizzard, and after that, the cold wave will sweep south toward the Great Tang. In addition, even though we're still purchasing food and wool, offering to pay twice what we usually pay, these products are no longer purchasable on the market. The other countries have begun to place restrictions on these items. The Great Tang has far more people than the other countries. If we had not made preparations in advance, the results would have been unimaginable. Su Qichin held a list in her hand as she reported on various matters. With her last words, she breathed a soft sigh of relief. In all things, preparation meant success while lack of preparation led to ruin. Although the cold wave had yet to engulf the south, the damage it had already done in the north was enough to make anyone shiver in fear. Attempting to prepare for the cold wave right as it was about to erupt was far too late. Wang Chong was unperturbed. For this matter, the imperial court had spent more than 1 billion taels of gold, himself putting out 400 to 500 million. This wasn't even considering the large amounts of hybrid rice he was importing from the Promised Land. Otherwise, the tens of millions of people in the Great Tang would have never been able to get through this period smoothly. I trust you. With you handling things, at least the Great Tang will be able to get through this period peacefully, Wang Chong said. When it came to logistics, Su Qichin had never disappointed him. Su Qichin softly smiled, her face slightly blushing. Right. How are things on your end? Su Qichin quickly regained her focus. The situation was urgent. She was primarily helping Wang Chong by calming the people and helping the local governments withstand the cold. But Wang Chong was personally presiding over foreign affairs. One domestic and one foreign, the two perfectly complemented each other. Wang Chong took a sip from his tea before confidently saying, "It's about ready. All the steel and craftsmen have already arrived." Su Qichin's eyes flashed as she asked, "What of Inauthentic?" Same as usual, anxious to make his move. "He's been gathering his soldiers, so he will probably start soon," Wang Chong indifferently said. "So you're saying that he's already succeeded in persuading Goguryeo, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, the Shi, and the Khitans?" Su Qichin saw the implication in these words, her brows creasing in concern. "There's a solution for every problem, and I've already handled matters. If Inauthentic dares to send out his soldiers, that will be the day he seeks his own destruction. I have a big surprise waiting for him." Wang Chong put down his teacup, his eyes cold and his face exuding a natural confidence. From the moment he had been reincarnated, he had been waiting for this day. In this Ensure rebellion, he had already removed the Sure. This time he would get rid of the N once and for all and remove this threat to the Great Tang. "Your Highness!" Rapid footsteps interrupted Wang Chong's train of thought, and a moment later, Xianxia rushed inside with a letter. As his mouth opened to speak, he spotted Su Qichin and froze. "Lady Su, Your Highness, I'll take my leave and come back later." Xianxia felt embarrassed and immediately backed out of the hall. "There's no need," Wang Chong lightly said with a wave of his sleeve. Xianxia had clearly misunderstood something. "Speak. What happened?" "Yes." After a moment of hesitation, Xianxia recalled the contents of the letter, and his face turned grim as he began his report. "We've just received word that Inauthentic soldiers are showing increased signs of activity in the northeast, seemingly preparing to begin their assault. In addition, our scouts in Yuzhou have also found traces of Tibetans." Buzz. Wang Chong's pupils constricted, his expression turning ice-cold. Dalen Trinling. He had been constantly watching the other countries this entire time, and he had sent them letters warning them against alliance. And it had only been the countries bordering Yuzhou that had had close relations with Inauthentic. But if Dalen Trinling and Yusang joined Inauthentic's alliance, the situation became entirely different. Though Inauthentic had a powerful army and Gao Shang advising him, in the end he was not mature enough. But Dalen Trinling was different. He was even older than the likes of Zhangqiu Jianxiong, and he was considered one of the finest strategists of the continent. For the two of them to join would be like giving Inauthentic wings. He would have the strength to sweep over the realm. Clap. Wang Chong flicked his fingers, sending a bolt of energy outward. On a metal fretwork table nearby, a large map of the Great Tang and its environs unrolled. Wang Chong rose and walked over. Xianxia and Su Qichin followed. Wang Chong scanned the map, his gaze flitting over Yuzhou, Goguryeo, and the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, and then Yusang before suddenly, it turned and stopped at a region in the northwest corner of the map. The only country that has yet to express its stance is the Western Turkic Khaganate. It's not that easy to make an alliance. Attend me. Write a letter to Ishbara Khagan. Wang Chong coldly chuckled, a sharp glint in his eyes. The Western Turkic Khaganate was located between Yusang and the other countries, serving as an extremely important hub region, and Yaluoshan had already recruited Yusang and the other countries in the north. If he also got the Western Turkic Khaganate, he would succeed in creating an arc of allies around the Great Tang that could exert enormous amounts of pressure. But Wang Chong would not let them finish this arc. The moment Yusang joined in Yaluoshan's alliance, the Western Turkic Khaganate to the northwest became of vital importance. If he could throw a wrench into the Western Turkic Khaganate, he could split off Dalen Trinling from Yaluoshan. The combo of Dalen Trinling and Yaluoshan would be extremely difficult to deal with if they were together, but when separated, they would be much less of a threat. Wang Chong could even deal with them one by one. Yes. Zhang Ke bowed and quickly departed. Whoosh! A few moments later, a messenger bird flapped its wings and flew toward the northwest. Time continued to pass, and the temperature of the northern end of the continent continued to plunge, the world becoming blanketed in snow. With each passing day, the situations of the various countries grew worse. At this moment, in the northwest, to the north of Baiting, the distant Western Turkic Khaganate had become the center of attention. The mood had turned strange and bizarre. At this moment, around the Western Turkic holy mountain of Mount Sanmi, whoosh! Bitter winds howled across a vast steppe that had been turned into a sheet of white. Shepherds wearing thick fur capes were driving snow-covered and ill livestock to the south. This sort of scene could be found all over the steppe. As the weather grew colder and colder, both the livestock and the Western Turks themselves faced dire situations with regards to food and cold. Each day, numerous people froze to death. The empire was in great peril. Fourth Prince, we don't have much time left. At the base of the mountain, a chubby man looked into the distance as he rubbed his hands. The man, wearing thick wool clothes and sporting a thick beard, was none other than horse merchant Hulayeg. In front of him was a young Hu of unusual bearing. He wore black robes, on the back of which had been woven a blazing sun and a howling wolf. He was looking in a daze at the peak of Mount Sanmi. This was none other than the Western Turkic fourth prince that Wang Chong had once taken hostage, and his name was Barzhad. Ever since Agudulan's death, fourth Prince Barshad's and Hulayeg's statuses in the Western Turkic Khaganate had grown worse and worse, and as they both fell out of favor, they gradually began to draw closer and closer. By now, Hulayeg had become the fourth prince's close confidant. With this great snow, the Khagan will probably make his decision in a few days. Hulayeg looked through the snow at the summit as he spoke. The Khagan is growing more favorable to the first prince with each passing day. Once the Khagan decides to ally with that side, we will completely fall out of favor. Hulayeg glanced at the fourth prince. In the past, the fourth prince enjoyed immense favor, but ever since about 1 year ago, when the Khatan died, everything had changed. First Prince Urbis Shiryun obtained great General Wunu Shibi's support and rose into Ishbara Khagan's good graces. Slowly, he came to replace the fourth prince as the next Khagan. As for fourth Prince Barzhad, his past connection with Wang Chong caused him to be rejected by the court and come to be regarded as part of the Protang faction. This was not a big deal in the past, but now the court was rife with hidden dangers. The Western Turks had divided into two factions, Proyojo and Protang, and the struggle for supremacy was extremely vicious. Since ancient times, the War of the Princes had always been the cruelest of conflicts. This was true not just for the imperial households of the Central Plains, but also for foreign courts. The current situation indicated that the moment the first prince took the throne, fourth Prince Barzhad and his entire faction would probably be pulled up by the roots and completely exterminated. I do not believe that Khagan would treat me that way. The fourth prince clenched his teeth as he looked up at Mount Sanmi, but his tone of voice betrayed his lack of certitude. Ha! Hulayeg could only deeply sigh. A new sovereign brought with him new officials. The Khagan had favored Bars had only because of the Khotun. With the Khotun dead, how could Ishbara Khagan possibly treat him the same way? Galloping came from the direction of the summit. Hooves kicked up snow from the surface of the mountain, drawing the pair's attention. Is that fourth Prince Bars had? A voice boomed out. The Khagan has ordered the fourth prince to immediately enter his tent for an audience. Bars had and Huleeg trembled. They glanced at each other, both seeing the solemnity in each other's eyes. Let's go. Without another word, the two of them began to push their way through the snowstorm toward the summit. At this moment, atop Mount Sanmi, within a giant tent, hiss, pop, red chunks of charcoal burned within a giant bronze fire basin, hissing and crackling as sparks leapt into the air. Muscular figures brimming with energy were gathered around the basin, their expressions grave. What's the situation? Ishbara Khagan was seated cross-legged on a fine Sassanid rug as he sternly spoke. One of Judu Fulua's subordinate generals lowered his head and solemnly said, Your Majesty, the situation is even worse than we imagined. Great General Judu Fulua has sent word that the snowstorms have completely ravaged the north. He tried to go past Lake Baikal and venture farther north to investigate the source of this cold wave, but when he was still 700 to 800 li from the Arctic forests, he could advance no farther. Great General Judu Fulua tried many times to penetrate the blizzards, but the moment he got close, the stellar energy around his body would freeze into shards and his physical and mental energy would be rapidly consumed. If he did not turn back at once, he would have died on the spot. From what the Great General has said, it seems that only those at the dark radiant heaven realm or above can penetrate that storm. What? Everyone else in the tent paled at these words, even Ishbara Khagan. This furious cold wave had placed the empire at risk of extinction. Thus, Judu Fulua had been dispatched to see what was going on. No one had expected that someone of Judu Fulua's cultivation would fail to penetrate through the cold wave. And the reason he had sent a messenger was most likely that he had been badly injured during his mission. A peak great general had been heavily injured in the cold wave? How was that possible? Just how extreme was this cold that would injure a great general and make it difficult for him to promptly retreat? This fact left everyone in disbelief. For a moment, the tent was silent from the shock. The fate of the empire was at stake, so Great General Judu Fulua would not possibly lie. Calamity. A true calamity. At this moment, everyone recalled the Western Turkic prophecy of apocalypse that had been circulating around the Great Steppe for thousands of years. A normal winter would never reach such a terrifying level. This could only be explained by that prophesied calamity. Everyone's hearts turned heavy. After a long days, Ishbara Khagan finally spoke. How are Great General Judu Fulua's injuries? Putting aside the cold wave, Judu Fulua's situation was of utmost importance. Judu Fulua wasn't the strongest in the Western Turkic Khaganate, but he was the most loyal. This was why Ishbara Khagan had sent him to the north. The great general's injuries are not light, and he is still recovering in the north. It will be some time until he can return, the General Judu Fulua had dispatched respectfully said. Ishbara Khagan let out a sigh of relief. Though he could not return to Mount Sanmi yet, at least his life was not in danger. Given the current situation, how long can we last? Ishbara Khagan asked. The cold wave is continuing to move south. Based on the speed of the blizzard at Lake Baikal, it will take 8 days at most until it reaches the northern edge of the Great Steppe, and then for Mount Sanmi, it won't be much longer, Judu Fulua's subordinate firmly said, his eyes scanning the crowd. The faces in the tent turned even gloomier, and Ishbara Khagan's eyes started to twitch. The Western Turks had already suffered devastating losses to this extremely cold weather. Numerous livestock and shepherds had frozen to death, and his scouts were saying that the cold wave was continuing to move southward. If the cold weather over Lake Baikal descended on the Western Turkic Khaganate, their empire had a chance of being wiped off the face of the continent. This cold wave was far more serious than he had imagined. A Western Turkic general finally broke the silence and called out, Your Majesty, we can wait no longer. If this continues, the very existence of the Western Turkic Khaganate will come into question. Our first priority should be to quickly ally with Inauthentic. All of the other countries are in dire straits. Only the Great Tang is calm and peaceful, barely suffering any impact from this cold wave. They've also stockpiled large amounts of food. This is the only chance for the rest of us. The Great Tang is simply too powerful, and at a time like this, they won't be coming to help us. Only by joining with Yuzhou and the other countries, combining our strength, and then attacking the Great Tang, can we avoid this calamity and preserve our Western Turkic Khaganate. This is the only solution. Even a great general like Judu Fulua had been wounded by the cold. Once the cold wave came in earnest, how many people in the Western Turkic Khaganate would survive? That's right. Your Majesty, we can't delay any longer. Speed is paramount in war, and allying with the other countries is the only way out. And think about that prophecy. The South is our only chance at survival. The other generals and governors voiced their agreement. Besides calamity, the prophecy of the Great Steppe had also talked about survival. No one knew when this prophecy began to circulate, but it truly did mention that the South was the only chance at survival. Whoosh! At this moment, the flapping of wings came from outside. A few moments later, a large gerfalcon flew through the snowstorm and into the tent. Everyone immediately turned to the bird. A general came forward to receive the gerfalcon, removed the letter, and glanced at it. Your Majesty, a letter from Yuzhou. The mood in the tent instantly turned strange. Same as last time, about the alliance? Ishbara Khagan asked, his expression calm and unperturbed. Yes, the general nodded. They had already received many such letters, but Ishbara Khagan had suppressed all of them, causing them to vanish like stones into the ocean. I see, Ishbara Khagan indifferently replied, saying no more. In the tent, First Prince Urbis Shiryun shared a glance of mutual understanding with Wunu Shibi. Urbis Shiryun stood up, made a hand salute, and firmly said, Imperial Father, we can't continue to delay. Time will not wait for us. And Yaluishan and the other countries have invited us again and again, and now is the best moment for us to join. Moreover, the Great Tang is abundant with resources with far greater stockpiles than ours. Attacking the Great Tang is the best way to get through this trial. Next to First Prince Urbis Shiryun, Great General Wunu Shibi came forward. Your Majesty, though the First Prince is young, this general believes he is right on this matter. To not make a decision when decisiveness is called for is certain to sow chaos. Moreover, the alliance of the countries is now set in stone, making this the best time to deal with the Great Tang. And has your Majesty forgotten the previous humiliations? One was the future Khagan and the other was a great general. Their words combined carried an entirely different weight. The final comment in particular made Ishbara Khagan's eyes twitch. In the border incident, Wang Chong had sent a letter threatening that he would hunt with Ishbara Khagan on Mount Sanmi, forcing Ishbara Khagan to withdraw his million-man army. All of the surrounding countries knew about this incident and joked about it, and Ishbara Khagan had marked it as a lifelong disgrace. Moreover, even without this incident, the Western Turkic Khaganate and the Great Tang were old foes. Over the course of several hundred years, the two sides had clashed countless times. It was impossible to count the number of Turkic braves who had died to the Tang. As the sovereign of the Great Steppe, Ishbara Khagan had been born with the ambition to expand his borders, desiring to bring the Western Turkic Khaganate to its apex. But the Tang forever remained an obstacle. That the Western Turkic Khaganate was still confined to this small region, that was the Great Steppe, was in large part due to the Great Tang. Deep down in the hearts of Ishbara Khagan and any other Western Turk was a deep loathing for the Great Tang, though it was not a hatred normally brought up. But the Great Tang, Ishbara Khagan's eyes flickered, and he stopped deliberating. Your Majesty, you must not. Another Western Turkic general suddenly spoke up, his eyes filled with worry. Any Western Turk had thoughts of vanquishing the Great Tang, but that was then and this was now. Everyone had seen how the Arabs had ended up. The Arabs gathered an army of 2,600,000 elites, had a powerful expert in Kataba, and summoned many of their governors, the Ifrit and the Behemoth army. But despite all this, they still lost to the Tang, and their capital of Baghdad was taken and their country vanquished. Everyone, ask yourselves, can our cavalry compare to Arabia's cavalry? Is our army as strong? And in this situation, what if we were to fail? Even Arabia was vanquished. What do we have that can oppose the Tang? Moreover, if we join the alliance army and attack the Great Tang, we could succeed or fail. But if we fail, we might suffer such devastating losses that our children might be enslaved by the Tang, our people forced into servitude for the rest of time. Numerous generals in the tent paled. The Tang were arrogant, yes, but this arrogance was founded on strength. With examples of the past to look to, they understood that defeat would lead to unimaginable consequences. Absurd! Wunu Shibi's voice erupted in the tent, his gaze as cold and sharp as a blade. The cold wave is imminent. If we don't join the alliance, must we feign civility with the Great Tang? Countless livestock and shepherds in the empire have frozen to death, and you speak on behalf of the enemy? This general must question your intent. Talk. What did you receive from the Tang, that you would speak up for them? With a clang, Wunu Shibi drew his saber halfway out of its sheath, causing its bright surface to flash with a savage light. Great General! Everyone paled in alarm and came up to stop Wunu Shibi. Meanwhile, the Western Turkic general whose words had incited this reaction paled. Suddenly, from a corner of the tent, behind all the other generals, Celestial Wolf Great General Duwu Sili spoke, his voice cold as ice. Humph, Great General, as long as you can say that you simply need to grab your saber and mount your horse to take Wang Chong's head, I am sure that all the people of the Western Turkic Khaganate, including this Duwu Sili, would support you in joining the alliance. I am sure that with Great General's ability, this should be as easy as lifting a hand, yes? Wunu Shibi narrowed his eyes and coldly replied, Such impudence! Duwu Sili, you defeated general, do you have the right to speak here? In the Battle of Talas, the Celestial Wolf Cavalry were wiped out, and you still have the face to speak here? Bastard! Duwu Sili exploded in rage, his fists clenching. In the Battle of Talas, he had fallen for Wang Chong's fake formation phenomena and his army had been routed back to the west. In the Western Turkic Khaganate, his status had also taken a fall into the abyss. This could be seen from how he, a great general, had been placed at the very back row for such an important meeting. As the two quarreled, Ishbara Khagan's impatience grew, and finally, with a roar, he stopped the two of them. Enough! All of you, shut up! Whoosh! Seeing Ishbara Khagan's rage, the generals in the tent fell silent, fear in their eyes. All of them dropped their heads, Wunu Shibi and Duwu Sili included. While Wunu Shibi and Duwu Sili's quarrel seemed to be over the alliance, in reality, everyone knew that it was about the war of the princes between the fourth prince and the first prince. Ishbara Khagan massaged his twitching brow and turned to a nearby figure. Blackwater Shaman, what is your view on this matter? Have the gods sent down a decree regarding this ice calamity? The gods have not sent down a message. Nearby, the Blackwater Shaman was seated cross-legged on the side, unmoved by the ferocity of the arguments taking place around him. Ishbara Khagan deeply frowned. The Blackwater Shaman had a transcendent status in the Western Turkic Khaganate, and he had always supported the fourth prince. For the Blackwater Shaman to have not sought a message from the gods with this fatal threat of the cold wave approaching was far too abnormal. Whoosh! As Ishbara Khagan was deep in thought, the flapping of wings came from nearby. A few moments later, a warrior entered the tent with a muscular messenger bird. The warrior got down on one knee and said, Khagan, a letter from the Central Plains. His one sentence caused everyone to pale. The Central Plains. Truly, when speaking of Cao Cao, Cao Cao would arrive. They had just received Yaluoshan's letter urging them to join the alliance. And now, they had received a letter from the Great Tang. It would be different if the letter had arrived at any other time, but it happened to arrive just as they were discussing whether to join the alliance. The faces of everyone in the tent turned strange, with the pro-alliance first prince and Wunu Shibi deeply frowning. This bastard! Wunu Shibi clenched his fists, hatred in his eyes. Even now, he could not forget the humiliation he had received from Wang Chong at the Feast of All Countries. The timing of this letter's arrival was far too coincidental. He didn't need to think very long to know that this was undoubtedly Wang Chong's handiwork. But no matter how shocked and surprised he was, anything concerning Wang Chong had to be considered rationally. "Read it," Ishbara Khagan coldly ordered. "This?" The general looked at the letter and hesitated. In the Western Turkic Khaganate, any letter from the Great Tang concerning Wang Chong would not contain pleasant contents. This letter would naturally be no different. The Khagan ordered you to read, so read. You can simply summarize the main contents. There's no need to read it word for word. The Blackwater shaman suddenly said. Yes. The Western Turkic general felt as if he had been pardoned, and let out a long sigh of relief. The letter from the Great Tang's king of foreign lands says that they already know about what has happened on the Western Turkic steppe and are willing to offer assistance. The Western Turks and the Great Tang have a history of friendship, and so both sides should continue this tradition. The Great Tang is willing to allocate a region for the shepherds of the steppe to move into to avoid the blizzard. The Great Tang is also willing to offer food supplies to aid the Western Turks. At this point, the general snuck a glance at the crowd. The tent had fallen silent, and he could clearly see the strange expressions on everyone's faces. The Western Turks and the Great Tang had a history of friendship? Was that king of foreign lands serious? Over the course of several hundred years, the Western Turks had engaged in hundreds of conflicts with the Great Tang, if not thousands. Who was Wang Chong trying to fool here? But at a time like this, nobody openly stated this fact. As for the second part, regarding the Great Tang allowing the Western Turks to move into the interior and their willingness to provide supplies, the generals had to admit that they were surprised. Anyone who had the slightest understanding of the king of foreign lands understood that this was completely out of line with his style. This was like food raining down from the heavens, and for some reason, it made everyone feel extremely uneasy. Just what is this bastard thinking? Ishbara Khagan's brow twitched. He was somewhat unable to fathom Wang Chong's thoughts. For some reason, he felt that this matter could not be as simple as it seemed. As expected, a few moments later, the Western Turkic general read off the other part of the letter. But he has heard that there are some rebels causing trouble in Yuzhou on the northeastern border, and he says that as the Western Turks and the Great Tang are brotherly countries, he is certain that the Western Turks will not refuse assisting its brother in eliminating this problem. As the general spoke, the tent became deathly still, the faces of everyone else in the tent a sight to behold. As expected, they knew that there was no such thing as food raining down from the heavens. Everything had its price. And Yaluishan hoped to recruit the Western Turks to attack the Great Tang, while Wang Chong hoped to recruit the Western Turks and have them assist him in dealing with the alliance army. Truly, there is no such thing as an oil-conserving lamp, Ishbara Khagan said to himself, an indescribable feeling in his heart. But regardless, the attitude of Wang Chong and the Great Tang had greatly softened. In this way, the Western Turks could derive benefits from both the Great Tang and the countries of the northeast, a surprising harvest. At the very least, the Western Turkic Khaganate had the initiative in these negotiations. Are you done reading? Ishbara Khagan asked, his expression relaxing. This? The general glanced at the letter again and hesitated. What? Is there still something else? Ishbara Khagan raised an eyebrow, immediately sensing that something was wrong, that there was something different from what he was expecting. That man from the Great Tang has also said that if Khagan feels that there are some things that are hard to convey in words, he is willing to come personally to Mount Sanmi to discuss the matter with Khagan, the general said as he turned the letter over to show it to the crowd. At that moment, everyone could see "Meet at Mount Sanmi" written clearly on the letter, written several times larger than the other words. Whoosh! Those strongly emphasized words caused all of them to understand, and as they turned their heads, they saw that Ishbara Khagan had a nasty scowl on his face. After all this time, that bastard from the Great Tang hadn't changed one bit. He had found it strange that this scoundrel had suddenly had a change of heart, offering such good conditions to the Western Turks. But in the end, if they didn't accept his conditions, this scoundrel planned to attack Mount Sanmi. The words had changed, but the meaning was the same. Hua! In the somewhat rigid atmosphere, the flap of the tent shook as two individuals, bringing with them wind and snow, came inside. Imperial Father, you asked for me? Bars had respectfully bowed to the people in the tent. Whoosh! Upon seeing the fourth prince, everyone in the tent quietly exhaled. The fourth prince's arrival had somewhat relaxed the stifling mood in the tent. Sit! Ishbara Kagan quickly got a hold of himself. With an emotionless face, he pointed at an empty seat nearby. Yes. With no questions, Bars had sat down. I am in the middle of discussing with the generals the matter of the ice calamity. The Great Tang and Yuzhou have both sent letters trying to draw us to their side. What is your view on this? Do you think the Western Turkic Khaganate should join the alliance or side with the Great Tang? Ishbara Kagan sternly said. He gestured, and someone in the tent placed both letters in Barshid's hand. The tent fell silent as everyone stared at the fourth prince. First Prince Urbis Shiryun coldly laughed and then silently watched. This ice calamity threatened the existence of the entire Khaganate and the longevity of their people. He was quite interested in seeing what his fourth brother said. The mood turned strange. Everyone knew that the stances expressed by First Prince Urbis Shiryun and Fourth Prince Bars were likely to decide their future status in the empire and the fate of the Western Turkic Khaganate. Even the Blackwater shaman turned to Bars at this time. Everyone waited with bated breath. Meanwhile, Fourth Prince Bars had looked at the two letters, and when he saw the words at the end of Wang Chang's letter, he couldn't help but frown. But a moment later his brow relaxed. Urbis Shiryun, seeing the expression on Barshid's face, suddenly spoke up in a mocking tone. Fourth brother, you're the savior spoken of by the prophecy. What is your view on this matter? The fact that Barshid was the child of prophecy was a secret in the Western Turkic Khaganate, and not many people knew about this besides the Blackwater shaman, the high nobles, and the great generals. But Urbis Shiryun was one of the people that knew, and this was precisely why he was so hostile to him. The Great Tang's king of foreign lands has disrespected Imperial Father more than once. Fourth brother, in this situation, you wouldn't have him join the Great Tang, right? Urbis Shiryun jeered. Hearing Urbis Shiryun's words, Duwu Sili, Hulayeg, and all of Barshid's other supporters grimaced. Urbis Shiryun had an ill motive with these words. If Bars had dared to say that he supported the Great Tang, he would be disrespecting Ishbara Kagan. The hierarchy of the Western Turkic Khaganate was strict, and if he made such a claim, Bars could put aside any thought of inheriting the throne. Such malicious intentions. Duwu Sili turned grave. But Urbis Shiryun wouldn't think about saying such words. There's a high chance that Wunu Shibi is instructing him. Duwu Sili quickly turned to Wunu Shibi standing behind Urbis Shiryun. Wunu Shibi had a stiff expression, acting as if he hadn't done anything. But Duwu Sili saw his lips slightly moving. At this moment, Wunu Shibi sensed his gaze, spotted Duwu Sili, and quickly closed his mouth. The mood in the tent became heavy. Quite a few of the generals in the tent understood what Urbis Shiryun was up to, but everyone remained silent. Imperial brother, as a member of the imperial household, what should be most important to us? Is it not the continuation of the Khaganate and our people, the Western Turks? Or does Imperial brother believe that personal emotions transcend the existence of our Western Turkic Khaganate? If that is really the case, then what does Imperial brother believe to be the reason Imperial Father has gathered us here? Bars had finally spoke, and his words instantly made Urbis Shiryun scowl. In addition, I was once taken hostage by the Great Tang's king of foreign lands and was humiliated by him. For this reason, should I oppose the Great Tang at every turn and disregard any thought of the welfare of our people? If we decide things on emotion, make the wrong choice, and the Alliance army is defeated, who will take the responsibility? He spoke with such a righteous air that even Wunu Shibi paled. At this point, the smile on Urbis Shiryun's lips had disappeared. Barshid's words had been far sharper than he had imagined. In the center, Ishbara Kagan frowned in thought. Bars had turned to Ishbara Kagan and sincerely said, Imperial Father, our Western Turkic Khaganate truly does have a deep grudge against the Great Tang. But our first priority is to find a solution to the cold wave and its blizzards that are moving southward. The Great Tang is strong at the moment, and it has now recruited more than 1 million soldiers, far more than before. Moreover, the king of foreign lands is at the peak of his power, and the entire world acknowledges him as the war saint. In terms of strategies, no one in the world can contend against him. Right now, he only lacks an excuse to attack us. The moment he discovers that we're communicating with Yuzhou and preparing to attack the Great Tang, he'll have exactly the opportunity he is looking for. And when the army of the Great Tang arrives, the end of the Western Turks will come. Your son hopes that Imperial Father will carefully consider this. Ishbara Khagan couldn't help but be affected by these words. Barzhad was close to the Great Tang and had a large following amongst the intelligentsia of the Khaganate. He had originally summoned Barzhad to casually ask him a few questions, but these words truly were very reasonable. Bad. Upon seeing the look on Ishbara Khagan's face, Urbis Shiryun and Wunu Shibi both trembled in shock. Imperial Father must not. Urbis Shiryun wanted to say more, but Ishbara Khagan raised his hand and stopped him. His eyes half closed as he raised his head and began to think. All in the tent waited with bated breath, knowing that Ishbara Khagan was considering his decision. After a long while, Ishbara Khagan finally opened his eyes and spoke. This conference ends here today. We have taken in all your opinions. This matter will be discussed again in the future. Hua. Everyone in the tent was surprised by this, and the generals were left flabbergasted. It was clear that none of them had expected this answer. All of you leave. Ishbara Khagan swept out his hand, his tone brooking no objection. Yes, they wanted to argue some more, but Ishbara Khagan's words immediately dispelled such thoughts. All of them quickly withdrew. Urbis Shiryun and Bars had glanced at each other, each seeing the fierce glint in the other's eyes, and then they looked away and left the tent. Outside, the snowstorm continued to howl. Finally, once everyone in the tent was gone, the seated Blackwater shaman got to his feet. Is your majesty still thinking about dealing with the Great Tang? The Blackwater shaman slowly walked over to Ishbara Khagan's side. The inconclusive end to the meeting was regarded by many as Ishbara Khagan considering the Great Tang's proposal, but the Blackwater shaman could see that Ishbara Khagan's stance had never changed. Yes, now that no outsiders were present, Ishbara Khagan did not hold back. In truth, shaman, you should know just as well as I do that the Great Tang will always be an enemy of the Western Turks. Moreover, does shaman still remember that prophecy? The Blackwater shaman said nothing, but the fog around his face stirred as he slightly nodded. The steppe will one day be destroyed, and that day is not far off. This was a prophecy passed down through generations of shamans, and Ishbara Khagan had known about it since he was a child. But the prophecy had come alongside another, and this was that the fourth prince in that year of disaster would be the hope of the steppe who would lead all of the people of the steppe out of the peril of annihilation. This was why the fourth prince had a special status. Ishbara Khagan placed his hands behind his back and continued to speak. It's just that I'm still unconvinced, still unable to choke down that anger. We still want to try one more time. If the Alliance can destroy the Great Tang, do you think that we can defy the prophecy? And the Western Turks can once more become the master of the continent. He knew the Great Tang was powerful, so powerful that the Western Turkic Khaganate could not possibly contend against it alone. But deep down, Ishbara Khagan just couldn't let go. This steppe had actually had several Khagans. It was not some unbroken line of succession. But few people knew that this last line, Ishbara Khagan's line, was actually the true master of the Great Steppe. Many people on the Great Steppe had forgotten, but Ishbara Khagan had always remembered that several hundred years ago, on this vast steppe, there had been only one name, no east or west, only one empire. And its name was the Great Turkic Empire. Countless nomadic tribes had been gathered together into a massive existence that spanned east and west. It had made countless factions tremble, and even the mighty Tang Empire had been forced to prostrate at its feet, trembling in fear. When he heard from his father about the stories of his ancestors, he mentally swore that he would one day unite the Eastern and Western Turkic Khaganates and shake the empires to the south, becoming the strongest and most powerful empire on the continent. Alas, he was not able to fulfill his ambition. After a short moment of resplendence, he faced hindrances on all sides. He once had a chance to utterly crush the Eastern Turkic Khaganate and unite the Great Steppe, and the Eastern Turkic Khaganate had been in its most chaotic period at the time. Alas, the Tang Empire to the south intervened, eventually rendering his efforts for naught. Whether he went east, west, or south, he found obstructions wherever he went, and they were all linked directly or indirectly to the Great Tang. This was why he eventually changed to become a Khagan who sought to preserve what he had. But as a sovereign, he was still somewhat unwilling to accept his fate. He did not want to give up so easily to the Great Tang. He always wanted to wait a little longer. What if there was another chance? Ha! The Blackwater shaman let out a deep sigh. Not many people knew about Ishbara's innermost ambitions and desires, but he had always known. Since that is the case, I have nothing to say. Khagan, do as your heart desires. A gust of cold wind blew past, and the tent fell silent once more. Far off in the capital of the Great Tang, in the King of Foreign Lands' residence. Though all sides were tense and in turmoil, the main hall of Wang Chong's estate was shut tight, ripples of stellar energy spilling out. Inside the hall, Wang Chong was seated cross-legged on the floor. His body was surging with energy, light bursting out and illuminating the fuzzy outlines of the furniture in the hall and shadowy pillars. If one looked carefully, one would realize that the air within 100 feet of Wang Chong was distorted, tinged with weak spacetime ripples. Occasionally, a thin spacetime fissure about the size of a fingernail would appear. Truly incredible! A barely audible sigh of praise came from within the hall. So this is the law of spacetime. While Wang Chong's body was in the hall, a part of his soul and mind had penetrated into the depths of spacetime. This was Wang Chong's first time in this strange world. Previously, Wang Chong had seen the world as a painting. He saw whatever was on the painting. But now, Wang Chong's view of the world turned from a thin canvas to a thick picture album. For the first time, Wang Chong sensed that this world was divided into many layers, each one bursting with mysteries. No longer would he believe that tearing a small hole in the paper was enough to see spacetime. Their levels of richness were on a completely different scale. Truly unbelievable. Wang Chong's mind followed the thin tendrils of spacetime law as he wandered this infinite dimension. These tendrils of spacetime law were like the strings of a kite, pulling Wang Chong deeper and deeper, and they were also his guarantees of safety in this world. The depths of spacetime were far too vast and complex, and its makeup was not something as simple as black and white. Some spaces were overlapping on each other like the pages of a book, and there were other spaces that were extremely fragmented yet tightly concentrated like a gravel road. And there were even larger spacetimes that were like infinite mazes. In the face of infinite spacetime, all martial artists were insignificant. Wang Chong's mind continued to drift in this place, information pouring in from all sides. In this state, the speed at which Wang Chong comprehended spacetime was many times faster. Observing spacetime, feeling spacetime, interacting with spacetime, controlling spacetime. These should be the various thresholds on the way to the Grotto Heaven realm. With my current progress, I should have reached the minor threshold of interaction, which is half a step from Grotto Heaven. Wang Chong inwardly muttered to himself. Outsiders watched the show while insiders learned the secrets of the trade. Wang Chong had always believed that when he absorbed Firmament Supreme's Grotto Heaven law and became capable of seeing spacetime laws, he had reached the half-step Grotto Heaven level. But even though he had obtained much of Firmament Supreme's Grotto Heaven core, he had not truly absorbed or mastered it. He had only reached the shallowest level of observing spacetime. After the Imperial Prison Revolt, however, Li Xuantu's palm had truly opened the gates to the world of Grotto Heaven, allowing him to absorb Firmament Supreme's Grotto Heaven law. Wang Chong's understanding of spacetime was now on a completely different level. The notes left by the Sage Emperor had mentioned that the path from the subtle realm to the Grotto Heaven realm was excruciatingly difficult, a massive chasm between them. To cross this chasm was equal to ascending to the heavens. But Wang Chong sensed that if he combined the powers of his 3 divine embryos, it wouldn't be long until he crossed this chasm and broke into the Grotto Heaven realm. Wang Chong continued to immerse himself in this mysterious world, absorbing knowledge from the depths of spacetime. Whoosh! After some time, a faint ripple ran through the hall, and that sense of overlapping spacetime disappeared. Wang Chong's mind and soul receded back into his body. Wang Chong opened his eyes, which unleashed a bright burst of light that quickly faded. Wang Chong finished his cultivation session. Tap tap tap. A knocking came at his door, and Wang Chong heard Zhang Ke's voice. "Your Highness, your subordinate has something to report." Bang! Wang Chong waved his hand, upon which the heavy doors flew open. The man outside stood in a daze in a moment before entering. "Your Highness, news from the frontline fortress in the northeast. Everything is ready. All that's needed is your Highness." Zhang Ke bowed. "Oh!" Wang Chong's eyes flickered, and then he got to his feet. "It seems that the time has come." Wang Chong took in a deep breath and closed his eyes. At the same time, his mind crossed through space to contact one of his divine embryos, located far in the northeast. Although Wang Chong was in his residence, his divine embryo had left the capital long ago. The greatest benefit from his 3 divine embryos was that he could appear anywhere at any time without leaving his own home. Whoosh! A few moments later, on a distant mountain slope in the northeast, Wang Chong opened his eyes. Snow drifted down from the sky while winds howled at his ear. The northeast was much colder than the capital. "Hurry! Pick up the pace. We have to get this done by the appointed date. Coal. We need lots of coal. Forging team. Pick up the pace." Urgent voices could be heard all across the land, penetrating through the snowflakes. Nay! The neighing of horses and clattering of armor entered his ears. Wang Chong raised his head to look. In front of him was a massive fortification. Rows of thick barricades and spikes formed a massive arc around the base. Unlike normal barricades produced by the Great Tang, these barricades were taller than a man and covered in sharp spikes, enough to make any attacker shiver in fear. Behind the barricades and spikes were tall observation platforms, each one 20 to 30 meters tall and garrisoned with 4 to 5 master archers. They warily watched their surroundings and could probably detect an enemy from as far as 8 li away. Farther back were large iron cauldrons that were packed with kerosene, coal, and dry wood, flames fiercely burning within them. The snowflakes blown over by the wind were thawed by the heat waves before they could even get close. These thousands of metal cauldrons served as the greatest source of heat for the base. "Keep your back straight. Be vigilant. The fighting is going to start soon. Are you going to act this way on the battlefield too? Maintain a firm grip. When the battle begins, nobody is going to care that you're cold. Single line snake formation. Show it to me again. Master Archer Team. I'm inspecting your archery one more time." In the base, rows of infantry and cavalry were divided into neat ranks. Some of them were patrolling the area while the rest engaged in drills in the center of the base. In the middle of the army, 2 black banners snapped in the cold wind, one depicting a scarlet dragon and the other depicting a 5-clawed golden dragon. These 2 banners represented Crown Prince's junior guardian Wang Zhongxi and Tongluo Great General Abusi. The forward base. Wang Chong quickly shook himself out of his stupor. This was the forward base for the entire northeast. More than 400,000 soldiers had already gathered in this small region. It was an unimaginable army, and it was also presided over by 2 powerful great generals, Wang Zhongxi and Abusi. "Hiya!" Wang Chong spurred his horse into a gallop, pushing through the snow. At the very front of the forward base, in front of rows of disciplined soldiers, were 2 powerful storms of energy. These were none other than Wang Zhongxi and Abusi. "He's here." Abusi's eyes flashed as he rode his horse out of the forward base. Behind him, Wang Zhongxi subtly nodded and followed. A few moments later, some 6,000 feet from the base, the 3 commanders met. "Is everything ready?" Wang Chong skipped the pleasantries and got straight to the point. Has His Majesty made up his mind?" Wang Zhongxi asked. Without another word, Wang Chong took a token from his waist. "How long will the rest of the soldiers take to arrive?" Abusi solemnly said. "All of them will arrive in 7 days." Wang Chong indifferently said. Wang Zhongxi and Abusi both exhaled in relief. Even though the forward base had 400,000 soldiers, Yuzhou itself had 600,000, And there were also the armies of Goguryeo, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate, the Shi, and the Khitans to consider. Together, it constituted a force of millions. The 400,000 soldiers of the forward base were far from enough. But once the rest of Wang Chong's army arrived, the situation in the northeast would be completely different. Hiya! Wang Chong didn't stick around, spurring his horse and riding between the two great generals toward the forward base. Wang Zhongxi and Abusi glanced at each other and then followed. Within the forward base, Zhang Shouji, the formation elder, and the top craftsman from the craftsman team had gathered together, looking up at the mounted Wang Chong. "Your Highness!" All of them bowed, awaiting Wang Chong's final order. All was quiet as Wang Chong turned his gaze toward the distant Yuzhou. Yuzhou seemed calm on the surface, but Wang Chong could clearly sense a baleful energy soaring out of the horizon. When Wang Chong was recruiting soldiers, Yuzhou had also been building up its soldiers. This place had become the greatest problem for the empire. In Yaluishan, this time, I'm going to give you a real surprise. As numerous thoughts ran through his mind, Wang Chong waved his hand down. Begin! Rumble! At that moment, the earth began to shudder. The moment Wang Chong gave his order, the entire power structure of the northeast, no, the entire continent, shifted. Bang, bang, bang. Around Wang Chong, metal hammers slammed down, and with resounding cracks, the tens of thousands of large wooden boxes that had been accumulated in the forward base were opened, revealing the metal modules within. This was not the first time Wang Chong was using this trick, but it was completely different from before. Clang! Metal hammers fell, sparks exploded, bellows pumped, and smoke and flames rose into the sky. One furnace became 2, 3, 4. In just a few moments, hundreds to thousands of metal furnaces blazed up. Whoosh! And a few moments after that, bright molten metal began to flow along channels. The forward base became like an awakening metallic beast, all of its systems spinning up. One metal module after another was removed from its crate, loaded onto specialized carts, and swiftly transported to its place in the forward base. Unlike the metallic modules of the past, these modules were a dark black and more than twice the thickness. Moreover, the surface of the modules was covered in the intricate designs of formations and inscriptions. And these inscriptions and formations resonated with each other, as if they were all part of some even more immense formation. Bang! Behind the large barricades, the modules were erected, molten metal poured down to swiftly install these metal slabs weighing tens of thousands of gene. Countless soldiers and craftsmen worked around the metal modules, reinforcing and connecting them together. In just a short while, a grandiose steel wall had been formed, seemingly appearing out of thin air. And if one looked down from the sky, one could watch as a line of black steel walls began to steadily spread across this large region that was the intersection between the Tsang province, Ing province, and Hung province. Even though it was still in its nascent form, it was already enough to exert a massive pressure. Nay, in the distance, atop a hill, several Yuzhou horsemen who were responsible for observing the forward base widened their eyes. What is this? What are they trying to do? This is bad. Hurry and report this to His Excellency. The Yuzhou horsemen turned their horses around and sped away. They had been watching this place for a long time, but before this, the general structure of the fortress had never changed that much. Some goods would be transported inside, and some new barricades and spikes would be installed. But this was something else. It felt as if a dragon was waking from its slumber. Rumble. As the work on the forward base began in earnest, the great turmoil caused was felt as far away as Yuzhou. Within the Anong Protectorate headquarters, and Yaluishan, Chui Qianyu, Tianqingxi, Gaoshang, and almost all the elite members of Yuzhou had gathered in front of a large model. They were in the middle of discussing their strategy against the Great Tang. At this time, the hall began to tremble. What's going on? And Yaluishan frowned as he raised his head. This is from the southwest. The others in the hall also sensed this disturbance. The Anong Protectorate headquarters had been built many years ago, from extremely tough and dense materials. It would never tremble like this in normal circumstances. This was not something any ordinary tremor could cause. The southwest? I'll go and look. And Yaluoshan's eyes narrowed. With a sweep of his sleeve, he strode out of the hall with a dark expression, his subordinates following right behind him. The southwest? If he remembered correctly, that was exactly where the Great Tang's forward base was. Whoosh! As he emerged from the hall, a cold wind flecked with snow blew past, the turbulence cutting at him like a knife. Boom! Ha! In the distance, a blurry silhouette became visible on the southwestern horizon, and a sound akin to the crashing of waves could be heard. Even though it was a very distant sound, if one listened carefully, one would realize that it was a sound formed from the shouts of tens of thousands of people. Everyone instantly paled. A long time had gone by without a disturbance. What in the world was the Great Tang doing? Gallop! As all of them were wondering what was going on, the thundering of hooves came from the distance. A moment later, they saw a Yuzhou horseman kicking up snow as he frantically rode toward them. The moment he arrived, the Yuzhou horseman dismounted and got down on one knee, speaking in a hurried voice. Your Excellency! Activity to the southwest. All of the craftsmen in the Great Tang's forward base have begun setting up steel walls. What? And Yaluoshan's brow creased and his eyes filled with confusion. At this time, Gao Shang was also confused. Setting up steel walls? What did that mean? Didn't the Great Tang's forward base already have those giant barricades and spikes? Even if they were building a wall, was it really deserving of such a fuss? But Gao Shang knew that this matter had to be more complicated than it seemed. Seeing how this Yuzhou horseman was gasping for breath, he also understood that there were some things that common soldiers like this could not describe very well. Come on, Your Excellency. Let's go and look, Gao Shang solemnly said. And Yaluoshan already had the same idea, and a few moments later, they mounted their horses and rode toward the forward base in the southwest. As they approached, the sound of crashing waves grew louder and louder. Listening to the signals called out in unison, all of them turned somber. Your Excellency, it's up ahead. The Yuzhou horseman who had reported the matter led the way. After another tensome li, the group finally saw the forward base. Amidst drifting snow, a long wall as black as ink stood tall over the earth. However, contrary to what the horseman had reported, the wall around the perimeter wasn't just the height of an adult man, but 10-some meters high. It was a sight with enormous visual impact. A grandiose sight. How could this be? The Yuzhou horseman who had reported the matter stared in wide-eyed shock at the black wall meandering across the horizon like a black dragon. It was about 2 hours to go to the Anong Protectorate headquarters and return. He clearly recalled that the walls had not extended so far and had only been about the height of a man at the time. For it to have changed so much in so little time was truly unbelievable. Bang! Thick columns of smoke broke through the snow into the clouds while the hammering of metal rang out through the world. And Yaluoshan, Gao Shang, Xianxia, and Cui Qianyu looked grimly at the bustling activity before them. At this moment, Xianxia looked around and suddenly pointed at a hill. Your Excellency, we can look from over there. This place was still some distance from the forward base, but that hill was probably the sole vantage point that would allow them to look within the base. The group quickly rode toward the top of that hill. Upon mounting the hill and seeing what was behind the pitch-black walls, all of them trembled in intense shock, even though they had somewhat prepared themselves for what they might see. Within the walls, even more walls were being erected, rows and columns intersecting, turning the insides of the forward base into a series of fortresses. This was no longer a wall of steel. What was being constructed was a massive city of steel. Whoosh! The hill was silent, except for the howling of the storm. At this moment, everyone atop the hill felt a chill in their bodies. A city of steel. Everyone suddenly recalled that Wang Chong was renowned for something else besides his military stratagems. But this city of steel was even larger than the one constructed at Wushang. Could not be called a city of steel, but a steel fortress. A steel fortress that was being constructed at astonishing speed. Zhao Can swallowed and began to hesitantly speak. Your Excellency? He shared the same idea as Cui Qianyu and Baijian Tuoluo, their eyes gleaming with concern and killing intent. These bastards could not be allowed to continue constructing this sort of fortification. If they wanted to stop it, attacking now was the best chance. Can the final batch of Yeluo arrive today? And Yaluoshan suddenly asked. The generals fell silent, and in the end, Xianxia spoke. No! His voice was incredibly bitter. He was responsible for intelligence and patrols. He had his men spread out all across Yuzhou, but there had been no trace of the Yeluo. Everyone fell silent. The time at which the construction of this fortress had begun was far too well chosen. It was right before the Yuzhou group was done with its preparations. Moreover, the Great Tang had lacked an excuse to attack Yuzhou, so it had concocted this war declaration against Goguryeo. If they attacked now, they would formally break with the Great Tang, allowing the Great Tang to attack without fear. The moment they started, the final battle would begin. This was not a decision lightly made. Gao Shang and Yaluoshan squinted, still looking at the base. Gao Shang said nothing as he considered what to do. Wait, now is not the moment to strike, Gao Shang firmly declared. Minor impatience could ruin great plans. Now was not the right moment to strike at the Great Tang. Moreover, the other countries had only just agreed to the alliance, with the exact details still up for discussion. More importantly, even if they attacked, there was a chance that they could be walking into a trap. Perhaps the Tang had been waiting for precisely that moment. Bastard! And Yaluoshan's face turned dark, and he clenched his fists in anger. He had 600,000 Yuzhou soldiers, numerous officials and generals, an alliance with various countries, and nearly 20,000 Yeluo. But despite his much greater power, he was still forced to hold himself back. It was utterly absurd. And Yaluoshan's group was not the only one who had noticed this development at the forward base. At the border of Goguryeo, Yun Geisaman was wearing a dragon robe that had been modified to be close-fitting. He looked toward the distant east, his face grave. An army of several 100,000 soldiers had gathered within the Great Tang's forward base. With an important war coming, how could Yun Geisaman not have sent soldiers to scout the area? It's finally begun. King of foreign lands, it won't be long before we have our true battle. Yun Geisaman crumpled the paper in his hands. He could sense the faint tremors from the west and see the thick smoke rising into the air. Even now, he had yet to meet the Great Tang's king of foreign lands. Mengshi Zhao Yusang, the Western Turks, Arabia, the king of foreign lands had subdued many of the surrounding countries in his rise, but for various reasons, the king of foreign lands had never had any direct conflicts with Goguryeo, the Eastern Turks, the Shi, or the Khitans. But this was all history. Very soon, all the empires of the northeast would make the king of foreign lands their enemy and commence the final battle. The battle had yet to begin, but Yun Geisaman already felt pressured. In the past, he wouldn't have taken this immature brat seriously, even after he won the War of the Southwest. But now, this was no longer the immature young marquis, but the supreme war saint. You're already there, right? Yun Geisaman looked to the east, his eyes erupting with resolve. Even though he couldn't see anything, he could sense that the renowned conqueror of Arabia, the war saint, had already arrived in the northeast. The war is about to begin. On the holy mountain of the Eastern Turks, Osmish Khagan emerged from his tent with all his generals, looking toward the south. The shift in the northeast had also alarmed this ruler of the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. While Osmish Khagan was middle-aged, he was still much younger than Ishbara Khagan. He had a thick beard, dark skin, deep-set eyes, and a body that radiated savagery and aggression. Osmish Khagan was a man who had seized the throne of Eastern Turkic Khagan during a period of chaos. He had taken his seat much later than Ishbara Khagan and lacked Ishbara Khagan's dejection that had come from multiple setbacks. He maintained his proactive and ambitious nature, a wolf in hiding whose claws remained sharp. He had also received a report on the developments in the south. Khagan, the Great Tang might really make its move, a muscular man said in a rough voice as he stomped through the snow to Osmish Khagan's side. This man had a sharp and sinister gaze, and a body packed with explosive power. This man was an Eastern Turkic great general, Taichi Bil Eli. Taichi Bil Eli possessed astounding strength, and he was an extremely aggressive commander. He had presided over the Eastern Turks for many years and clashed with Zhang Shoguei at his prime numerous times. He had been able to hold back Zhang Shoguei's assault numerous times, proving his strength. Osmish Kagan blinked and said, "He truly can't be underestimated. We suddenly begin to understand why Catawba and Arabia were destroyed at his hands. The pace of the Tang to the south was much faster than he had imagined. Even though the other countries had begun to draw together, the Great Tang remained powerful, and its tempo was getting faster and faster, placing more and more pressure on their shoulders." Osmish Kagan turned to Yuzhou and muttered, "Let's see what Inauthentic does." Inauthentic was essentially the leader of this alliance. Even though Inauthentic was simply a border general and no emperor, incomparable to the likes of Osmish Kagan or Yun Geiseman, no one objected to him serving as the alliance head. The people of the Great Tang understood the Great Tang the most. This was for the good of all the other countries. Meanwhile, in the forward fortress, Wang Chong had not simply constructed a base, had not constructed some simple fortifications, but a true stronghold. This fortress not only had barricades and spikes, but also a high perimeter. And within was a second defensive layer and a third. It was a massive city that could hold 700,000 to 800,000 soldiers. Soldiers were trained for 1,000 days to be used in a single moment. Wang Chong had bided his time with this surprise for Inauthentic, waiting until almost all the modules and tools needed for construction were transported to the forward base. Not even Wang Zhongxi and Abusi had realized the purpose of all those crates being transported into the base. Impossible! Even Wang Zhongxi and Abusi couldn't help but be stunned at how an enormous fortress had risen from the earth in the space of several hours. Wang Chong had only said he wanted to establish a forward base around the Tsang province. He had never talked about setting up such a comprehensive steel fortress. This wasn't their first time fighting alongside Wang Chong, but they were still left astonished by his unique way of fighting. With this steel fortress, we have a foothold in the northeast and can easily deal with the other countries. Abusi had a calm expression, but his mind was whirring with ideas. Wang Chong's methods were a shock to both his enemies and allies. Rumble. Hammering continued to ring out. At this time, Wang Chong, mounted upon a warhorse, was not paying any attention to Wang Zhongxi or Abusi behind him. His eyes flitted here and there as he kept track of the construction of the fortress. It wasn't just walls. If one observed closely, one would realize that a massive formation was being set up at the same time, but only a few people besides Wang Chong knew about this formation. How is it? Chill winds blew at the cape on Wang Chong's back as he turned to the nearby formation elder. What was coming next would be an unprecedented clash with the foreign countries. Walls and internal defenses were far from enough, and Wang Chong would have never entrusted his hopes to a simple fortress of steel. The formation is 60% complete. Once the last parts of the formation are linked, the formation will be done, the formation elder sternly said. Wang Chong had requested a formation of unprecedented complexity. It was made of tens of thousands of smaller formations, with the fortress itself serving as only part of the formation. The fortress will take around another 3 days to complete. I leave what happens next to you, Wang Chong indifferently said. Another great rumbling could be heard as a steel wall that had been 10-some meters high was raised to an even higher level. The fortress was rapidly reaching completion. The formation elder nodded. The sound of the construction and the hive of activity taking place amidst the snow had left the formation elder astonished. Even from the formation elder's perspective, this steel fortress was truly shocking. He had never seen anyone build a fortress like this, and on such a scale. And though many people had been gathered, everything was proceeding in an orderly fashion. All of this had every right to be called the work of a god. This sort of construction technique didn't seem to belong to this world. Meanwhile, Wang Chong was preparing to discuss his future plans with Wang Zhongxi and the others when suddenly, buzz! Wang Chong's eyes twitched as he raised his head and looked toward the north. And Inauthentic. His pupils constricted and his face instantly turned ice cold. Although he couldn't see with his eyes, he could sense an extremely familiar energy far to the north. Wang Chong instantly shot away like a bolt of lightning, and when he next appeared, he was atop the thick steel walls on the northern side. Meanwhile, atop that tall hill in the distance, and Yaluoshan suddenly raised his head and looked over. Bastard! It really is him, and Yaluoshan's body trembled all over, his face transforming into a nasty scowl. The faces of the others darkened. They hadn't understood what Yaluoshan was talking about at first, but when they saw the hatred on his face, they instantly understood. It's him! They all turned in the direction he was looking, all of them falling silent. Bang! A moment later, an immense energy rocketed into the air. Atop the wall, Wang Chong stomped forward, releasing his boundless energy. It was a giant beam of energy that pierced through the heavens, visible even from several dozen li away. Moreover, this pillar of energy was clearly a challenge. Humph! Wang Chong coldly laughed as he pushed his energy to the limit. At the same time, clack, whoosh, atop the hill, and Yaluoshan, Gao Shang, Cui Qinyu, and Tian Qingxi scowled. Before, they only had vague conjectures that Wang Chong might be in the fortress. But now, by erecting this banner, Wang Chong had flagrantly declared his presence. Wang Chong really had come to the northeast. And Yaluoshan, would you like to guess when this king will come to take your dog life? A powerful mental wave crossed through the air, carrying with it a resounding and emotionless voice to that distant hill. Bastard! The people on the hill couldn't help but be enraged by the contempt they heard in that voice. This cocky thing was going too far. Did he think that this fortress made him invincible? Once the third batch of 20,000 Yeluo arrived and the Yuzhou army was combined with the armies of the other countries, not even Wang Chong's fortress would be able to hold. Let's go! And Yaluoshan suddenly turned around and rode away. Now is not the time to meet with him. Genesis Supreme is still recovering, and we're still no match for him. Once everything is ready, I'll kill him together with that dog emperor. Minor impatience could ruin great schemes. Only by stomaching his momentary disgrace could he eventually hold his head high in victory. One day he would make Wang Chong pay for his arrogance. Humph! I'll let you live a few more days. There was a savage light in all their eyes. No matter how unwilling they were, they knew that now was not the time to get emotional and act on impulse. Gallop! A few moments later, they rode away, vanishing into the snow. Standing atop the high wall, Wang Chong could sense Yaluoshan's group fading away, but Wang Chong did not pursue. And Yaluoshan was an extremely crafty man, and they had chosen to stay very far away. Even if Wang Chong went after them, they would have more than enough time to escape. Moreover, Gao Shang wasn't dead and would remain a thorn in his side. Wang Chong was scheming against Yaluoshan, but it was hard to be certain that Yaluoshan wasn't also planning something. Wang Chong turned his head and sternly said, "Pick up the pace. The rest of the army will be here soon." Yes! Everyone behind him yelled in unison. Bang! The furnaces blazed and the hammering grew even louder, shaking the entire world. Wang Chong stood atop the wall, gazing at Yuzhou with an expression that grew colder and colder. A thought flashed through Wang Chong's mind. Only the Western Turks are left. Once the steel fortress was complete, the Great Tang's foundation in the northeast would be firm. When it came to positional advantages, it was now at least on par with Yuzhou and its allies. The only uncertain factor now was the stance of the Western Turkic Khaganate. Wang Chong had already received word that Dalen Trinling had unexpectedly chosen to side with Yaluoshan. Once the Western Turks finally yielded, that momentous war from his memories would immediately erupt. Wang Chong was confident that Yaluoshan was right in the middle of trying to recruit the Western Turkic Khaganate. But no matter what, Wang Chong could not let him succeed. Wang Chong turned in the direction of the Western Turkic Khaganate. His gaze seemed to pierce through space, peering into infinity. Bang! 3 days later, with a great rumble, Wang Chong's steel fortress was finally completed. As time passed, the blizzard crossed Lake Baikal and reached the edge of the steppe, but after that, its advance seemed to slow down. The other countries all appeared to be trying to deal with this ice calamity, and there seemed to be no activity from the people, But in secret, the various courts of these countries were all tensely looking toward the Western Turks. After several days of ravaging from the snowstorm, the temperature of the Turkic steppe had gotten even lower. Turkic cavalry rode around the vicinity of Mount Sanmi, but the entire region seemed to be getting more and more desolate. Not far from Mount Sanmi, within a golden tent that was covered in a thick layer of fur, a charcoal fire burned. Duwu Sili leaned against a table as he idly sipped on wine. Nearby was a young man wearing silk clothes, bent over a desk as he read a book. He was not reading some Turkic text, but a book from the Great Tang called Righteous Individuals and Important Political Figures.